Have you ever read any books in English? If you have, maybe you're looking for some new book recommendations. And if you've never read an English book, where's the best place to begin? What should you read? In this episode, we'll give you some book recommendations to help you get started and take your reading to the next level. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hello and welcome, especially if you're a new listener to the podcast. My name's Craig.
And my name's Reza.
And with more than 50 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you doing, Reza?
I'm doing fine, Craig. It's a Friday evening when we're recording this. You know what? I really fancy this evening a good book just before I go to bed.
Do you read before you go to bed?
Not half as much as I should. I used to a lot more. I've become a bit lazy. But I've started again recently, doing it, once or twice a month. It's not enough. And I'd forgotten what a great pleasure it is. It's lovely.
It's also really nice to come down and relax after a day, maybe looking at the screen and running around and working and just being a little bit stressed perhaps. And that 20 minutes of reading a good book really calms you down and gets you ready to sleep for the night. So it's a very good habit to create, I think. Now, before we speak about books and give you some recommendations, I don't know if you've noticed, Reza, but this is episode 493. And in only a few episodes' time, we're going to hit 500 episodes. What do you think? Should we do something special? Any ideas?
Yes, we should. I had noticed, it's going to be any day now. 500. It's a lot. Not that many podcasts reach episode 500, do they?
No, it's quite a milestone. A milestone is a significant event that maybe you should mark in some way and celebrate. So if you have any ideas, and I'm speaking to you, dear listener, not to Reza, if you have any ideas how we can celebrate this or mark it in some way and do something a bit special, please let us know, because we've been thinking about what to do and we're not quite sure what to do about it. So please let us know if you have any ideas or suggestions.
Well, let's get started with this episode with a voice message from Argentina, from Maxi.
Hello, Reza and Craig. How are you? It's Maxi from Argentina. I'm glad to tell you that I've been improving my listening skills with your podcast. And now, I'm trying to improve my speaking skills too. I want to make a suggestion for your podcast. I would like, if you can, to talk about Jorge Luis Borges, one of the best writers in Spanish language, but also he was a bilingual man, and he grew in an English family here in Argentina, and he has translated many other writers from English to Spanish. So I think it's an interesting connection between our languages and nationalities. I hope you take this topic for your podcast and send to you very kind regards. I enjoy your podcast very much. So that's all for me. Goodbye, and I will listening to you in your next episode.
Well, thank you, Maxi, for your very kind words about the podcast and for your suggestion this week. Your pronunciation is very, very good. We understood every word you said. Any comments, Reza?
Yes, I agree with Craig. You've very good pronunciation, Maxi. However, I did notice a couple of little mistakes, grammar mistakes, or maybe vocabulary mistakes, you might say. You said he grown in an English family. Well, grown comes from the verb to grow, but it's the past participle. Grow, grew, grown. So what you should say is the past. And we need a preposition. He grew up. That means he changed from a child to an adult. He got older. He grew up in an English family. Or you could make it passive. It's also typical to say he was raised by his parents. He was raised in an English family. That would be a better way to do it.
And a very small pronunciation point. I think you said bilingual. We would say bilingual. So a bilingual writer. And I think you said, I will listening to you in your next episode. It might have been a problem with the audio, but you need the word be in there. I will be listening to you in your next episode. Now, we're not going to focus the whole episode on José Luis Borges, but we will give one or two details about his life because, to be honest, I did not know much about him. I had heard of him, of course. I know he's a very famous writer. I knew he was from Argentina, but I didn't know much about him, and I definitely didn't know that he had probably one of the longest names I've ever seen, which, if you go to Wikipedia, his full name is Jorge Francisco Isidoro Luis Borges Acevedo. Did you know that, Rissa?
No, I had no idea. I had heard of the short version, Jorge Luis Borges, but I didn't know about all the other parts. That is a long name.
And he lived from 1899 until 1986. And as Maxi said, he was an Argentine poet, an essayist, and a short story writer, one of the founders of magical realism.
Oh, magical realism. That rings a bell. That sounds familiar. I also think of people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez when I think of magical realism. I like that style of writing. I'm not an expert on it, but any books I've read from that genre are very interesting, I think. But I have to confess, I haven't read any books by Borges. I'm going to confess it right now. I don't know why I haven't, because I've heard of him and I know he's one of the most important writers, not only in Spanish, but probably in the world. But I just haven't got round to reading any of his books yet.
Me neither. So maybe it's time we did. We have to get to know him. And according to my research on the internet, he didn't actually write in English, even though he spoke English perfectly. His books were translated from Spanish. But of course, he did speak excellent English because, well, first of all, he was homeschooled by his mother. That means she taught him at home. And after that, he went to a bilingual school. And eventually, in 1914, he moved to Switzerland, where he studied at the Collège de Genève. That was really bad pronunciation. The Genève College, let's say.
And we discovered that not only did he speak really good English, and you won't be surprised to hear really good French, since he lived in Switzerland, and Spanish because he was from Argentina, but he also spoke German and Old Norse. Now, Old Norse is not a language you're going to hear much these days. The clue's in the name, old. It was the language spoken by the Norsemen.
The Vikings, right?
The Vikings, basically. Vikings and similar people who were found in Scandinavia and at times in England and Scotland, depending on which century. They moved around a lot, invading places, coming and going. So we're talking about many centuries ago. And believe it or not, Borges was familiar with that language. So we could say he was a polyglot. He knew a lot of languages.
And if you want to read any of his books, and we certainly intend to, some of his most famous works include Ficciones, The Aleph, The Book of Imaginary Beings, and Labyrinths. And all of those are listed in the show notes to this episode at inglespodcast.com/493. Now, before we give you our book recommendations apart from the books of Borges, we want to tell you about how you can improve your English by studying with us. Now, not together. We don't give joint classes, Reza and I, at the same time, but you can study in small groups with me, conversation courses, and together we focus on speaking, on improving your confidence and your fluency, and we meet on Zoom. And they're a lovely group of motivated students that come together in order to improve their speaking. If you would like more information and the dates of the next courses, just send me an email to Craig, Craig, @inglespodcast.com, and I'll give you more information.
Like Craig, I also do some classes online, but I focus on one-to-one classes. So one student and one teacher meet rather than groups. Like Craig also, the focus obviously is going to be on speaking. That's the best way to build up your confidence, and it's the most important and most immediate aspect of communicating in English. But we can also work on whatever you might be interested in. Could be writing, could be grammar, vocabulary, fluency, you name it. If you're interested in a one-to-one class, why not send me an email to belfastreza@gmail.com.
So if you're interested in improving your reading, we've got some book recommendations for you. If you listen to this podcast and you understand most of the things we say, you'll probably be okay with the books we are going to recommend to you today from a level point of view. Now, you can get something called graded readers, and graded readers will take a popular book, a work of fiction usually, and they will simplify the language. But none of the books on our list are meant to be read as a graded reader. We think with maybe a little bit of help sometimes from a dictionary, you shouldn't have too many problems with these books on our list. And in fact, some of them are perfect for reading together with your children. So if your children are learning English, if they're at school and you want that 15, 20 minutes of quality time with your kids before they go to sleep, we've also got some recommendations for you for books to read with your children.
Yes, so as Craig said, we are thinking about the level of English in these books, which are not graded readers. So we've chosen books where we think you would be able to deal with the English. That will explain why some great authors are not on our list. For example, no Shakespeare. And Shakespeare certainly is an important author because it's very difficult, let's be honest. He uses that old English of, the 16th century, 16th, 17th century, and it's difficult for a native speaker to understand some of his vocabulary. So don't take this as a list of, these are the best authors, and we don't think Shakespeare's good. No, we're thinking about good books, but also that someone of a reasonable kind of intermediate, upper intermediate, or even advanced level of English would find challenging, but not too difficult. That's why we've chosen these books.
Exactly. And you've probably heard of the first author on our list, and that's Ernest Hemingway. Now, he's one of my favorite authors, not only because I really like the way he writes, but he does write fairly simple, straightforward, clear English. He doesn't use a lot of unnecessary adjectives and descriptive language. His way of writing, his style is very direct, and he tells a story very clearly. And of course, if you happen to be a Spanish speaker, you may find lots of points in his books to connect to your country, because one of my favorites from Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises, speaks about Hemingway's trips to Spain, the people he meets here, his life drinking and eating and going out in different cities in Spain, going to bullfights, etc. And another book, For Whom the Bell Tolls, is about the Spanish Civil War. My favorite, though, is a short book called The Old Man and the Sea. Very easy to read in English with a lovely message under the text. So if you do read that and you can see the message under the story, let us know what you find there. I'd be interested to hear your opinion.
Another author we would recommend because he's great, he's different, he's original, but also very, very readable, easy to access, is Roald Dahl. the British author. And his books, on the face of it, that means apparently are written for young people, but they're perfectly good for adults as well. But they remain to this day very popular with children too. We're talking about books such as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have seen a film version of that. So why not have a look at the original book?
Johnny Depp, wasn't it?
Johnny Depp, he did it. Well, for me, it's always going to be Gene Wilder, the
original, yeah.
the original film. But there's been other versions as well. But yeah, Johnny Depp's version was good as well. And James and the Giant Peach, and lots of other short stories. It's a great one to read with your kids because he's kind of a little bit irreverent. He seems to be very unconventional at times, but at the same time, not anything rude or terrible which children can't listen to. But at the same time, a little bit,
Weird,
and kids love that. They love the idea of someone irreverent, unconventional, but without going too far. Roald Dahl's your man for that.
Remember, you can see a list of these authors and books in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/493. Now, we mentioned the film version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. There's also been a film version, or more than one film, made about the Hunger Games, a book written by Suzanne Collins. The book is very good. I read it a few years ago. If you've seen the film, you can read the book without worrying about following what happens in the story, because you'll know what happens if you've seen the film. Although, probably better, in my opinion, to read the book first and then see the film, because usually the book is better than the film.
Yeah, and even if it isn't better, although it probably will be, I don't like the idea of a film version giving you ideas which maybe you weren't going to have if you'd read the book. Because whenever you see that the character, for example, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is Johnny Depp, you've got that into your head now, but maybe that wasn't the kind of character that Roald Dahl envisaged. But it's hard to get an image out of your head. That's why I think it's always better, for your imagination's sake, to read the book first and let your imagination do the work. Then look at a film version. And you might find yourself disagreeing with some of the things they've done in the film version. You can be more critical, I think, that way.
No, I agree 100%. In fact, that's the beauty of fiction when you're reading, because the mind's eye, the eye in your mind, the unseen eye creates an image, a version of what you're reading. And then when you compare it to the film, it's probably not exactly what you had imagined. So I agree with you 100%, Reza. Our next book is The Little Prince, which was originally written in French by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I think that's the pronunciation. It's a lovely short story, another great book to read with your kids before they go to sleep. The Little Prince. Have you read it?
I have, a long time ago. I can barely remember what it's about. I just know that it's a very, very calming book. I remember it made me feel really good after reading it. Can you jog my memory? What's it about?
No, I can't jog your memory. I can't remind you because, like you, I read it years ago and I can't really remember the story. But I do know there are many different versions of the book. And if you do buy it to read with your children, to help you and your children with English, then there are many different illustrated versions of the book with beautiful pictures and really nice illustrations.
That's right. Come to think of it, that means I hadn't thought of it before that. It's just come to me suddenly. Come to think of it, I used to know a person, I've lost contact, who collected editions of that book for the illustrations, because it's one of those books, as Craig says, which has many different versions, different editions with illustrations. And I actually knew somebody who had about 50 different editions. They collected that book.
Petit Prince.
Yeah.
Next on the list is Treasure Island and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, both written by the wonderful Robert Louis Stevenson. Have you read those?
I have. When I was a kid, I was a huge fan of Robert Louis Stevenson. And as well as reading the books, I loved any adaptation on TV, not only films, but sometimes there were series. It's just got everything that a kid and indeed an adult would want. It has adventure, it has excitement, it has double crossing, it has schizophrenic personalities, it has pirates. The literature of Robert Louis Stevenson has it all.
It's very colourful, yeah. What's not to like if there's pirates in it? The next book reminds me a bit of Reza, because I don't want to give away, which means reveal, the story of the book, which is the picture of Dorian Gray by the wonderful Irish writer Oscar Wilde. But it's basically a story of somebody who each day looks younger than the day before.
and you think of me, Craig.
And I think of Reza.
You need new glasses urgently. Make yourself an appointment at the optician.
So the interesting thing about the book is why this character, Dorian Gray, gradually becomes younger. Why? What's the reason? Well, if you want to find out, you have to buy and read the book.
To be honest, Craig, I was a bit worried for a second when you started there. I thought you were going to say that
you're a homosexual.
That I reminded you of Oscar Wilde. And I wasn't sure I had to take that, but no, Dorian Gray.
Won't be sending you to prison anytime soon.
Yes, of course. Oscar Wilde had to go to prison for being homosexual back in that time when it was illegal. He ended up in prison for his homosexuality, so that obviously had a big effect on his life. Our next author is Harper Lee. Now, she was from way down south in the United States.
Way down south.
Way down south, boy. We're talking about Cajun music, Mississippi, and eating grits, whatever they are. I've never known what, but apparently they eat grits and they play Cajun music down south. So it has a very southern feel to it in her book, her famous book, To Kill a Mockingbird. There's been a couple of famous film adaptations, though I think the original black and white one with Gregory Peck is still probably the most famous. Mm-hmm. They did a very good job with the adaptation, I thought. And apart from just being a really good read, the word read can be a noun. If a book is good, you can say it's a good read. It really helps you visualize what it would have been like, I think, to live in that atmosphere of the deep south of the United States at that time. I think it's set in the 1950s. It really captures the atmosphere, not only the good side, but the dark side of that atmosphere as well. Don't you think?
Yeah, it does. And we definitely recommend it to anyone who wants to explore the southern United States culture. So you can learn a lot about that in the book, but also it is a wonderful story about human rights and racism.
Just before we talk about our next book, which is a really well-known book, let me just remind you that we have given some recommendations in previous episodes about books. If you go back to episode 177, so there's a link in the show notes, that would be inglespodcast.com/177. In that episode, it was mainly about writing email and tech support, but we also give a little bit of recommendation about some books. That's why we haven't repeated them in this episode. Those books are Harry Potter. You're probably thinking, how come they haven't mentioned Harry Potter? Because it's back in episode 177. Animal Farm, a book which had a great impact on me when I was a kid. It's so easy to read, yet it's so satirical at the same time. Bridget Jones' Diary and Angela's Ashes, the book by Frank McCourt about someone's childhood in Ireland before he emigrated to the United States. So we haven't gone into detail about those books here because they're back in episode 177. There was another episode which could be useful. That's episode 280. There's a link in the notes. Go to inglespodcast.com/280. And in that episode, we give some advice on how to improve your reading skills in English. So go back to 177 and 280, and you'll find further information about reading in English. Okay, on to our next big book on our list today.
Because you mentioned Harry Potter, I would kind of put the next book in that genre of teenage novels and fantasy fiction, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, I've never read any of his books. I know they're incredibly popular. I have read the Harry Potter books, but for some reason, The Hobbit never really attracted me. Have you read any of his books?
Do you know, I haven't either, but I've seen the film adaptations and I like them, but they don't float my boat as much as other things. And I know that there are people who, virtually live and breathe The Hobbit, particularly younger men. It seems to appeal to that kind of fantasy world.
What does float my boat mean?
To float your boat is an idiom meaning make you feel really excited or just exactly the type of thing you like. That Hobbit doesn't float my boat.
Doesn't turn you on.
It doesn't do it for you really either, does it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't do it for me either. And I've tried to watch the films, but I just couldn't get into them. If you can't get into something, it doesn't grab your attention, doesn't take your attention and get you interested enough to continue.
The next on our list, however, is exactly my cup of tea. That's another way of saying it floats my boat. If something's your cup of tea, you like it. I'm talking about the classic, almost timeless Aesop's Fables. Now, some of you probably have never heard of Aesop, but I bet you've heard of the stories. I'm talking about fables or stories such as The Hare and the Tortoise. Does that ring a bell? The hare who thought he was so fast and the tortoise so slow, but the tortoise...
Hare's like a rabbit, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Town Mouse and the Country Mouse. The town mouse who was rich, the country mouse who was poor. But it turns out that if you're rich, you end up getting really stressed. So maybe it's not that great to be rich. Does that ring a bell? The wolf in sheep's clothing. The wolf looked like a lovely sheep, but turned out not to be so nice. You see a sort of theme there? In Aesop's Fables, they're stories, but they teach you something. There's always something to be learned.
There's a hidden meaning, isn't there, that comes out at the end. Yeah.
I bet most of you have heard of those stories. Well, maybe you didn't know, but they were written by, we think, a person called Aesop. Well, that's what we call him in English. And all I can tell you about him is that he was a slave. He was a slave probably in ancient Greece. It was quite common for the ancient Greeks and Romans to have slaves. It wasn't unusual then. Not very nice, but certainly not unusual. And this slave ended up writing some of the most legendary and long-lasting literature of all time. By the way, I can think of another slave who was pretty successful. A guy called Cervantes, who was a slave for a while as well. Wasn't that unusual to be a slave 500 years ago? Don't know if you knew that Cervantes was a slave for a while, the guy who wrote El Quijote. So, just because you're a slave doesn't mean you can't write a good book, is another lesson we can learn from Aesop.
And Aesop's Fables, as Reza said, have they're quite simple. They're quite easy to read. They do have a moral. They do have a meaning to them. And I think they're very useful for children to hear. Another book or series of books that I think are very good for children. My favorites growing up, books by C.S. Lewis. For example, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The Narnia trilogy, other books in the Narnia trilogy. I think Through the Wardrobe was another one, wasn't it?
Yes, there's a couple of other titles that people never remember as well.
Yeah.
They always remember The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's the most famous one. But I have read the others, but I just can't remember what they're called right now.
But they're lovely stories. They really are imaginative. And for a 12, 13-year-old child, for example, very, very entertaining.
And by the way, if you're ever in Belfast, do visit the C.S. Lewis Memorial, because a lot of people think he was English, but he actually grew up in Belfast. And Craig and I were talking earlier about maybe in the future we might do an episode specifically about Irish writers. So C.S. Lewis could be on our list, as well as Oscar Wilde and a few others.
For sure. Now, the next book might not be suitable for children. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. And I think we were talking before we started recording that this author and the next author probably didn't write in English. Their works or their books were translated into English. And Coelho wrote a lot of philosophical books. The Alchemist is quite short. It's quite easy to read. It has a lovely message in it and very recommended if you haven't read it.
And Craig, I haven't read the next one, but I think you have, by a German author, Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha. I think you said you'd read that, have you?
Yes, and it's one of my favorite books. It tells the story of Siddhartha, the Buddha, and his journey on the way to enlightenment, how he found enlightenment sitting under the tree and meditating. It's very simply written. It's a short book and definitely recommended, especially if you'd like a very brief, concise history of the Buddha and Buddhism itself, where it originated from.
So from what Craig says, it sounds as if there are certainly very important lessons to be learned if you read Siddhartha. And perhaps the same could be said for our next book, although different types of lessons, and that is Anne Frank's diary. So this is the one book which is non-fiction. It's not made up. It's real life. Anne Frank kept a diary, and it was so well written, and the information is so important that it's become a bestseller and still is all over the world. Basically, it's the diary of a girl growing up during the Second World War. She was from a Jewish family and her family were persecuted. So there are some very, very heavy parts in it. There's a lot of sadness in it.
It's a bit dark in places.
It's dark, but
depressing.
It's a book which still to this day is very popular with kids all over the world. So it is dark, but kids can handle it. And, kids need to know about history.
Yep.
And this is one way they can do that, through Anne Frank's diary.
Maybe a slightly lighter book, a lighter read is our next one on the list, which I actually haven't read, but doing some research for this podcast, this book appeared on so many lists of recommended books for English learners. It's The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. I don't know if you've read it, Reza. I haven't, but it's just been recommended so many times that I didn't want to leave it off of the list.
Yes, I've heard many people recommend that as well, but I haven't got round to. That means I haven't made the effort yet of reading it, but I really must check it out because so many people rave about it. If you rave about something, that means you're really enthusiastic about it.
The next one is a book we have mentioned before in a previous episode, the one that Reza mentioned earlier, but it is my wife's favorite author in English. She loves these books. She's learned a lot of English from them, so I really could not leave this off of the list. Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, excuse me. Definitely worth reading Sherlock Holmes's books. Very well written. Very entertaining, and of course, so many movies and TV series have been made about Sherlock Holmes. You obviously know what this fictional character is about, but reading the original books, I think, would be very rewarding for you and full of rich vocabulary.
Yeah, I'm glad you insisted on putting them there because I would insist on the Sherlock Holmes stories as well. I'm a big fan. My granny's old 1940s hardback in red edition is one of my treasured possessions to this day.
Your granny, your grandmother.
Yeah. It means a lot to me. That book, her Sherlock Holmes hardback, that means the cover, la tapa, was hard, not soft. That's one of my prized possessions. Something that I often used when I was a kid to live out my fantasies in the world of literature.
The next writer on our list is Robert Frost. I believe he's an American writer and he wrote poems I've never read. I don't think I'm familiar with his poems. You added this to the list, Reza. Why?
Because I do like his poems, or the ones I know. I'm not an expert, but I like some of his poems, and they're very, very often quoted as incredibly approachable. You don't need to have a great knowledge of English. There's no fancy words there. Yes, he uses some adjectives and adverbs, but he doesn't use obscure, crazy words or strangely constructed sentences, as it has to be said, some poets do, let's be honest, and it discourages people from reading poetry. Robert Frost doesn't do that. He's straightforward, tells a message, and yet the words seem really powerful. So he's often said to be one of the easiest poets to read. And I thought we have to put at least one poet on the list, because it's not all about novels and short stories. There's poetry as well.
Absolutely. So thank you for adding that to the list. And to your point about adding poems to the list, of course, you don't only need to read fiction books or books in English. Anything you read in English is good for your reading. So why not also read some short form content? For example, blogs on the internet in English, any articles that interest you, comics. We've spoken about comics before. They're very accessible and easy to read, also with children, or even reviews on the internet, reviews of films, software, anything you're interested in buying. Just make sure you're exposing yourself to reading in English as much as possible. And while you're reading these books, don't keep stopping to check words in the dictionary. Try to read a little bit for pleasure, even though it's not your first language. And if you see words that keep repeating and you become curious of what the meaning is of the words, then stop, check the meaning in the dictionary, make a note of the word, and continue. But reading is wonderful to improve your vocabulary, sentence structure, grammar. And Reza, you encourage students to read aloud sometimes, don't you?
Yes, I do. In class and to yourself as well. Record it.
How does it help?
Because very often students, they really don't know what they sound like. And they need either someone else to be listening, other students or a teacher, to be able to identify errors they have and their strong points, or they can listen themselves. You'd be surprised listening to yourself, if you record yourself, how you sound. I'm surprised when I listen to myself recorded in this podcast. Some of the things that I said, I can't believe that I actually said them.
Neither can I sometimes.
The sound of my own voice seems foreign to me. So it is a really, really useful thing, either to have someone listen to you or record yourself and listen to yourself. You will learn a lot, believe me.
And that brings us to the end of this week's podcast. But wait, don't go anywhere, because we want you to practice your English by sending us a voice message with any recommendations you have for books to read in English. I'm sure you have one or two books that you can tell us about, and we can pass on in future podcasts so that listeners can also get your recommendations as well as ours. Reza, how can people contact us with voice messages?
If you want to leave us a voice message, it could be about a book or it could be about anything you like. Have a look at the show notes. There's a place called SpeakPipe, and there you can leave up to a 90-second audio recording. It's at speakpipe.com/English podcast.
If you prefer to write, you can also send us an email. Emails go to me, Craig, Craig, at inglespodcast.com, or to Reza at Belfast, Reza, Reza, at gmail.com.
This podcast is sponsored in part by mansioningles.com. Why not visit the online store where you'll find a range of useful resources that will help you further practice your reading, writing, speaking, and listening, as well as grammar and vocabulary? Have a look at the link in the show notes. Go to store.mansioningles.net.
And we can't say goodbye to you without thanking all of you who are supporting us on our Patreon program so that we can continue creating more episodes. And you too can join our Patreon program for as little as $1.50 per month. And by doing that, you get instant access to the transcriptions of this podcast. For more information, go to patreon.com, patreon.com/Ingles podcast.
So we'd like to say thanks to all the supporters of Patreon, but we haven't got time. So as usual, we will just name the most recent sponsors who've joined us this month. They are Maria Rosario, Erisbel Marquez, Teresa Gil de Bienma, Esteban, Silvia, Miguel Lopez Costea, Lucia Gonzalez, and Dancho. A big thank you to those people for joining us and to all our regular sponsors as well.
Yes, thank you very, very much. Now, if you're preparing for an English speaking exam or even working from a course book in English, you're probably learning some specific expressions and phrases to use when you're speaking. In next week's episode, we're going to give you some extra phrases you can use that a native speaker might use. So join us next week and learn some expressions to help you pass your speaking exam and speak more like a native speaker. That's next week. Until then, thank you for joining us this week. It's goodbye from me.
And it's bye-bye from me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us by telling your friends so that more people can listen. And the music in this podcast is by Hits. The track is called See You Later.